Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of Michael Blair, the American drummer and percussionist who's worked, recorded, toured with the likes of Tom Waits, Elvis Costello, Lou Reed, worked with people like Allen Ginsberg, alongside Victoria Williams, Ryan Adams, Soul Asylum, and much, much more. But you're going to find about his life in this very interesting interview, so take notes. I will test you at the end. So after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to that exciting subject that was the early formative years. Michael, it's over to you.
Well, it was early 60s. I was born in 1954 in California. And then I was in a military family, so we moved on both coasts. But I started playing an instrument, accordion, when I was 7 years old. So it was fun to have music in the family. And I was listening to my father's records that were Nat King Cole, Keely Smith, Tony Bennett, and Leon Bibb, the folk singer. So I was getting a lot of sort of folk music, sort of jazz pop, in my head when I was really, really, really little. Yes. And then in the early 60s, I was really into pop music and listening to the radio all the time. And in the United States, it was long before the glam thing, and even before the Beatles hit. So it was early Motown, very early Motown, like Smokey Robinson, and the Beach Boys, the early Beach Boys stuff, the early Four Seasons, that kind of thing. So that was even before 1963 when the Beatles started happening. But as with most people sort of my age, guilty as charged, with the VJ album, the first Beatles album, I think was called Introducing the Beatles in the United States. And that was 1963, late 63. Yeah. And it was on VJ because, as all the stories have been told, Capitol wouldn't accept the first Beatles album in the United States. So the VJ album, the VJ company in Chicago released that. It was Please Please Me, for the rest of the world. And actually, the long answer to your question was I was already really into jazz and show tunes and then the early, like the Four Seasons, Beach Boys. It was all over the radio when I was a kid. But then the Beatles, they changed everything. I mean, absolutely.
Yes. And did people like Glenn Miller? Was he sort of on your or the Andrews Sisters, or people like Teresa Brewer, people like that? Did they come on your radar as well at some stage?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, not for me, like close to my heart. As a kid, I mean, that stuff was my mother's generation and father's generation and my grandfather's generation. Coming up in the 30s and 40s. With big band and then pop and like you said, Glenn Miller and Tommy Dorsey with Frank Sinatra and that sort of thing. And how much is that Doggy in the Window, stuff, that was really like pop music. So I was aware of that. It didn't really touch me as a child. And then by the early 60s, I was like, wow, this sort of Los Angeles, New York, London pop stuff is really starting to turn into something, so the stuff that you just described, I knew that my grandparents really enjoyed that sort of thing, but I that wasn't really my music, but I knew it existed, absolutely.
And with a sort of a certain military background in your sort of father's line, did things like, was he involved at all in the Second World War? Had he sort of been stationed in the UK at all at any point, or was he always kind of in America? Was that post-war period?
Yeah, my father he wasn't old enough to be involved with World War II. My grandfather was, my maternal grandfather. He was in the Navy, the American Navy. And he and his family, that was my mother and my uncle and my grandmother, maternal grandmother, they had been stationed in Hawaii a couple times. So they were actually at Pearl Harbor in December 1941. So when my mom was a kid and my uncle and then my grandparents, they were actually there. My grandfather was a radioman working at Pearl Harbor. So unfortunately, they lost a lot of friends and colleagues that day, as did everybody, in Pearl Harbor. But my father joined the Navy in Nebraska. He was from the Middle West, and Nebraska, right in the middle of the United States.
Yes.
And he, when he graduated from college, he was in the NROTC. So he was the beginning of the Navy officer corps. So he went to Korea. So to long answer to your question, I mean, he served in Korea. That was his first billet,
Right.
in military action.
Yes, that's amazing. Because then you must have been in the house the day that, the news of JFK being assassinated. Did you remember that
Oh,
moment?
absolutely. I was in third grade, I think, in 1963, November 1963. Um, so yeah, I mean, all those things colliding, I had sort of started to get a feeling like who the Beatles were. But then
Yes.
on the other hand, I was in 1963, in November, so I turned 9, that month. And yeah, I mean, I was at school, and everybody in California, got that news, an hour or two after, it happened in Texas. And and yeah, I mean, everybody was sent home. All the teachers said, everybody go home, and we stayed home the next day as well when Lee Harvey Oswald got shot, so I watched that on TV, black and white TV, like everybody else did. I was only 9, but yeah, I mean, to see anybody at that level get killed, that was an eye opener for me. I mean, it hadn't really dawned on me that that could happen.
Yes, it's kind of boggling, isn't it? Because actually, you
Oh,
would have been very aware of all the social, political, and cultural changes that took place in the 60s. That would have been a
right.
conversation around the tea table, breakfast table. Just hearing, what was changing. Plus, going to the moon as well, and then the
Right.
cultural shift of the 60s into that kind of psychedelic period as well. In
Mhm.
about, I don't know, 4 years, 3, 4 years after you hit sort of 10, it
Right.
suddenly shifted again. So how were you and your relationship with the parents at this stage? Were they quite happy to kind of embrace this, or were they holding holding strong and thinking it's Elvis and nothing else? Or were they
I
going,
mean,
no?
my father liked painting and he played piano, and my mother had been an actress and had a good speaking and singing voice when she was in high school and college. So they were both. They were also on the left side of being like a Democrat, in the United States in the early '60s. So
Yes.
even though my father was a naval officer, he was what now we would call like a left of center Democrat, and my mother was as well. So there wasn't a religious bias, there wasn't a sexist bias, there wasn't a racial bias in our little family. So I was lucky, in that way.
Yes,
Uh,
because they would have had that whole McCarthy period as well, wouldn't they? They would have had that kind of in
right,
their
right,
consciousness as well, which must have
right.
been an absolutely boggling time for anybody, especially in entertainment, because people were being accused of being communists.
Oh, exactly. I mean, my dad died when I was 13. He was 37. He died in an automobile accident in 1968. So I never really got a chance to talk to him about the 50s. I mean, I was aware of, I mean, the real, witch hunts and the anti, communist, down on the crazy artists and the writers and the blacklists and all that stuff. I was starting to get a feel for that. But yeah, like you said, I mean, they were young adults in the 50s when that was happening, and they were absolutely against, things like that. I mean, even though my mother's family was Navy, my father was in the Navy, so I was sort of 2 generations by then. It wasn't the let's go kill the bad guys and everybody except for Americans are the enemy. Our family was not like that whatsoever. So, and I guess another part of the answer to the question would be, they loved that I played an instrument. They were very supportive when I changed to drums when I was 10.
Hmm.
My first drum kit was a Ludwig, a Black Diamond Pearl kit, which was very similar to the Ringo kit,
Right.
which he got. I still have it. I still use it. I got that when I was, what, 11 maybe, and I used it in the little band that I was in grade school, and I still use it on records now, so, I think of, I mean, not to get too mushy, but I think of them fondly when I get out my, Ludwig kit, because that's the one that they got for me when I was 11 years old.
Well, yes, absolutely. My God, that's incredible, isn't it, really? So
Mm.
when you So when you got to sort of 67, did you sort of have that kind of, oh, you would have been 13, 14 at this stage,
Right.
which is kind of a good age, really, isn't it, to sort of discover Jimi Hendrix and the Doors and Morrison and people like that. Did that psychedelic kind of chapter come into your life at all at that stage?
Oh, absolutely. My father started bringing me to concerts like in 66 or so. I saw Simon and Garfunkel as a duo. It was sort of not so far after the first album that they released. I saw The Love and Spoonful, around that time. And I had their first records. I was getting all the Simon and Garfunkel records. I had all the Dave Clark 5 records. I had all the Herman's Hermits and Beatles and British Invasion albums. I was a huge Kinks fan, and the original Who singles. I was really sort of, my mind was being blown without understanding what a mind being blown meant, and to
Yes.
follow that. But then to follow the psychedelic thing, long before I discovered sort of like my mind expansion from chemicals and that sort of thing when I got much older, I heard the Jefferson Airplane, the original Jefferson Airplane, well, with Grace Slick,
Yes.
live. I heard the Doors live. There were a lot of bands that I started to listen to then, that I was just hugely influenced by, and my family was really happy that I would want to go to these concerts. So yes, I got a real education.
You got a real education on that one. Did you start sort of hanging out at Golden Gate Park and sort of going to I remember in 67, there was the Gathering of the Tribes, weren't they, in January of that
Right.
year, where they had people like Tim Leary and Ginsberg and the Grateful Dead were there, and Country Joe and the Fish. Did you sort of smell something in the air, which was probably illegal? But were you getting kind of excited at that kind of? Because I talked to Joe Boyd, he'd produced the first kind of Pink Floyd stuff and
Right.
the Incredible String Band, and he said, in 67 it felt like we'd won. They were going to these events, like, he'd set up this club called UFO in London. They went to
Right.
the 14-hour Technicolor Dream at Ali Pali, and it was like, watching the sunrise on one of these, after you've had your trip, and sort of watched Arthur Brown and Yoko Ono with her art performance, thinking, this is it,
Right.
everything is changing. Little did, obviously it doesn't end terribly well, does it? But did you have that sense of rebellion and excitement, or did things?
It wasn't really rebellion for me. I mean, I'm younger than Joe. I've met Joe a few times, and I've been a big fan of his productions, and we have a lot of colleagues in common and stuff. But he was older than I was, and also I was pretty much raised at that point in Southern California, which is really different from Northern California. It's
Right.
almost like there's so many people, and it's such a long state from south to north, that what was happening in San Francisco was very much different than what was happening like in San Diego or or Los Angeles. I mean, in our world, most of the garage bands were sort of surf bands, with the twangy guitars and Dwayne Eddy and the Ventures and that kind of thing. So, and the Beach Boys, and then the beginning of the session scene with the Mamas and the Papas and that sort of thing in Los Angeles. I was much more listening to things like that. So I didn't actually go to San Francisco as a teenager, to sort of be involved with that. But I was buying all those magazines as a 13 and 14-year-old. The Jefferson Airplane and the Doors and the Byrds and David Crosby, and what was happening with the counterculture and drug taking, and tune in, turn on, drop out kind of thing. I was aware of that because my parents were sort of political in that way and military, so I was aware of those things. But I was a little young to actually go to the festivals, and that was in the 70s for me.
Yes, absolutely. So when you got to that point where suddenly you'd started following people and you found yourself seeing that, Brian Jones, passed away, the Rolling Stones were having certain issues with the band, and then the next year, Joplin, Morrison and Hendrix sort of died, and then there was Altamont, there was the Manson and those murders. You would have been 16 at that stage, and obviously a lot had happened already. Did you feel the 70s were going to be a bit tricky, or did you all still feel excited?
Well, it wasn't really black and white in that way, but at the end of the 60s, I was so much into rock music. I was playing drums in the American version of high school. I was in politics, I was in sports, I was in the bands. So there were, I was in theater, acting, so there were a lot of different things in Southern California high school that I just dove in, so we were political. We had demonstrations at school. I was sort of the president of everything, my class and then the whole school, my last year there. And, so there were a lot of things in the late 60s, early 70s that were very political for us in Southern California, high school age. So everything from police to the school systems, to gender policy, and the beginning of the feminist movement and that sort of thing. That was very influential for me. But yeah, I mean, Woodstock and Altamont and that sort of thing. I was, wow. One of the things that changed, a big thing for me in 1969, I think it was, I was visiting my uncle in New York. I mean, this is sort of an answer in a way that he gave me some money to go to a record store in New York City and to get whatever I wanted, basically, which was lovely, for me as a, like you said,
Yeah.
16 or something like that. So what I got that day was the second Blood, Sweat and Tears album, which had Spinning Wheel and those amazing arrangements, with that full sort of like little big band, and then Led Zeppelin 1, with your time is going to come, and just all of that stuff. I knew who Led Zeppelin was because I was a Jimmy Page fan from Yardbirds, so that was a big thing for me. And then the first Crosby, Stills and Nash album, so that day I got those 3 albums and brought them back to my uncle's apartment and just listened and listened and listened, and that was a big mind-blowing moment for me because I was thinking, wow, 3 completely different sounding bands with the A-list of musical virtuosity and clarity in what the band was, what those bands were. And then for me, I was a young sort of politically oriented musical sports kind of guy, at that age. And I was thinking, this is a gold mine. I mean, at the time, I didn't necessarily think I was going to be a professional musician, but listening to those and the stories, the politics, the characterizations, the way the melodies worked with the harmonies. I mean, I'm still learning from all of those records.
Yes, absolutely. And also there was the backdrop of Vietnam and, the students being shot at Ohio, which must have been absolutely horrendous and sort of frightening as well. How did that sort of kind of mix in during that kind of period as well? Because obviously this backdrop of kind of complete violence and war that was kind of being seen in napalm.
No, absolutely. I mean, my father, as a military officer, he actually worked at the Pentagon for 2 years. He was in the Office of Naval Manpower, like working for the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1966 and 67. So when I was 11 and 12, I met the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon as a little kid, as the child of someone who was in those offices, and they were what was happening, the structure, the protocol, the goals of what was happening in Southeast Asia and that sort of thing. And to make a long story a tiny bit shorter, he would actually come home from work sometimes, and we had top secret documents at home all the time because he was working in those offices. That it was the national news, but it was my dad's job, at the Pentagon. And the actual answer, I think, to the question that you posed was, at that age, he even said, Robert McNamara and Lyndon Johnson have Vietnam wrong. This is not going to end well. It's not the war that the American public thinks it is. It's not the war that the American public is being sold by the Department of Defense and Lyndon Johnson as president, even in a democratic setting, with my mother and father being Democrats, voting Democrats. But he knew that Johnson didn't have it right. And this was like the year or so before Johnson even said in 1968, we don't have it right. Because he actually said that when Johnson decided not to run in 1968 again, to be president, he actually said out loud, this is not going well. I can't really represent the country this way, so I'm not going to, run again, which is unfortunately where Richard Nixon got in. But
Yes.
but the longer answer is I was aware of that. I was absolutely aware of that as an 11-year-old, because those were our dinner conversations at home. My father would actually just come right out and talk about his work that way. He wasn't trying to sugarcoat it. He wasn't trying to be, the big macho guy, at the Pentagon. He was going like, I've got information, and this is really not good. Long before Kissinger and blowing up Laos and all that other stuff. But he was really concerned.
Yes, I would imagine so. So when you got to 18, do you then, you're, in America, do you go to university or college at that stage and start studying music in even more precision?
Oh, absolutely. I went to a tiny college in Southern California called Johnston College, which was sort of a hippie school. There were sort of like ex-Harvard young, there was Gestalt therapy and mind games and all this like early 70s stuff. But
Yes.
From people from MIT and Harvard and Stanford and that sort of thing, they were the teachers, my first teachers, because I was originally going to read to be a psychotherapist, when I went to college. But soon thereafter, there was a small music school, and there was an orchestra and an avant-garde music ensemble and great percussion teachers. So I changed my major. In America, it's called the major, the line that I was going to take in college. So instead of reading psychology, I read music. So yeah, I dove right into it. Absolutely.
Yes. And did you at that stage sort of look at John Bonham and think, yes, that's who I want to be, and then think, oh no, there's a jazz guy, I want to be that. Oh, there's a blues. Oh my God, there's folk music as well. How did you sort of keep focus when there was kind of so much that you were listening to? Because mostly when people get into that age of the late teens, 20s, and they're in a band, their influences are quite small because they've only had a few years to sort of fixate on something and sort of slightly copy it. So how did you start sort of going down sort of very interesting rabbit holes at this stage?
I went into all of the rabbit holes in a way, because I was already fairly well read in different styles, and I was 17 when I started college, and I was young in my grade, so when I started university, I was 17, and I had already been a big Led Zeppelin fan. I'd already seen Led Zeppelin live. I'd already seen, when I was 18, I saw The Who live. I'd seen Creedence Clearwater live. I'd seen Poco live. So
had you seen Cream at all, Ginger Baker?
I did. I saw Cream. Their next to last show in California before they went back to England and broke up. So. Right. That last week or two, it was San Diego and then Los Angeles, and then they went back, I think, to the Royal Albert Hall or something like that, and then they broke up afterwards. So I saw them like 2 weeks before they broke up.
Right, my God, you've seen the major drummers at this stage, haven't you? At this point,
I didn't really understand sort of how bands worked in that way, but sort of to get back to what you were saying, Ginger Baker, I was really interested in. The session players that were playing on the Mamas and the Papas and the Beach Boys records and Burt Bacharach records, they were all the same musicians, and I was starting to get a feel that was true. I was studying with the principal percussionist from the Los Angeles Philharmonic. He was my main percussion teacher in that first few years of college. So I started. Philly Joe Jones, with Miles, and Tony Williams, like you said, John Bonham, Keith Moon. I didn't necessarily think that I could be any of them because they were so singular in their personalities. I didn't necessarily think that I could copy them or that I really wanted to, but I absolutely started to feel that I wanted to be in bands that were that good.
Yes. And what about the kind of avant-garde people like Captain Beefheart or Zappa? Because I did an interview with John Trumbo French once. I remember him at the end, I said, what would you tell your 16-year-old self? And he said, to have been with Crosby, Stills and Nash and made lots of money rather than be with Captain and just be tortured emotionally.
Well, that's an interesting thing because I didn't know Beefheart's people. I mean, at the end, after Beefheart sort of stopped having his band, I actually worked with Gary Lucas and Morris Tepper, who were the
Yes.
Captain's last two guitar players. So I'd worked with both of them in the '80s. I mean, years after they had left, Dawn, and even after I had started playing, with Waits, I was starting to meet people sort of that ilk, who were that good and that sort of, personally developed, on their instruments. So I was lucky that way. But yeah, I was hanging out with people like Harold Budd and the people from the Cal Arts, the California Institute for the Arts, John Bergamo,
Right.
and I knew who Emil Richards was, from the LA session scene, and I was a huge fan of Victor Feldman, the percussion player who actually was the percussion player later on Swordfish Trombones, with Waits
Right.
and stuff. So even in the '70s, I was starting to listen to people like that. And then, of course, Weather Report, with Ayrto and Eric Gravatt and Alex Acuna and Chester Thompson and Manolo Badrena, during the '70s while I was in college. Those were the bands that I really wanted to be in. I wanted to play with Miles in the '70s. I wanted to be in a band like Weather Report. I wanted to be in a band like the sort of folk, the acoustic folk band Oregon,
Yes.
that had Ralph Towner and stuff. Colin Walcott was a big hero for me. I got to meet them eventually and play with Paul McCandless, the oboe player from Oregon. So I started to meet people like that. And yeah, I didn't necessarily want to be in Led Zeppelin then, but I really wanted to be in Oregon or Weather Report, in my heart,
Yes,
because
absolutely.
I could play any instrument that I could bring to the session. It didn't have to be Latin. It didn't have to be rock. It didn't have to be anything. It was anything that I could think of that sounded really great. I could bring, to a band, so that was my goal.
Yeah, it's interesting because I did an interview with Hunt Sells, who was, with the Sells brothers, who were with Iggy Pop and then David Bowie and Tim Machine, and he came from, his father was Soupy Sales, which was that kind
Right.
of comedian, but he had a very jazz background, so he sort of was fixated on jazz musicians that he sort
Okay.
of was copying and bringing that into his rock and punk sort of a sort of arena, I suppose, and narrative. Did you sort of also delve into those kind of musicians from that period, 50s and 60s, the jazz drummers at that point?
Well, I did actually. I mean, Roy Haynes and Joe Jones. I met Papa Joe. I met him once at the Zildjian factory, the Zildjian cymbal factory. I was there picking out cymbals one day, and he was actually there picking out his cymbals one day. So that was you bow down at the father of the hi-hat and expressive jazz drumming. So I didn't necessarily think that I could swing well enough, or I wasn't that kind of groove jazz person in a way. I didn't necessarily think that I would be good enough to really play in bands like that. I mean, I wanted to learn so I could groove and have a good sound quality and tonal, I wanted my listening.
Yes.
That's a good way to put it. I wanted my listening to be as good as players like that. I didn't necessarily think I could go ding, 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 ding as well as any of them ever at all. But maybe I could listen and interpret and absorb music as well as they did.
Yes. And were you fascinated with the Beatles film, the 8-hour one that they did? Or was it Peter Jackson who did
I
this?
Get Back.
Yes. Did you see that 8 hours and sort of watch, Ringo and the way he held the Beatles together at times and the kind of interest in the relationship he had both with Paul but also with John as well?
Oh no, absolutely. The one thing I'd started to think of. I mean, I was a huge Beatles fanatic, so I've got all of the vinyl from the '60s in mono. I've got all of the vinyl from the '60s in the bad stereo. I've got all the CDs. I've got bootlegs. I've got the boxes that have come out the last 20 or 30 years. And books and books and books and books about all the studio experiences and which amp they used and all this other stuff. So watching the Get Back movie I was sort of well read enough in sort of like what they went through, I thought.
Yes.
Sort of watch that. One of the things that I was reminded of again as a player or as a fan of drumming and being in bands was Ringo's right hand on the hi-hat. That sort of bish 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 kind of thing that he did so well was absolutely in the pocket with John Lennon's right hand with John's rhythm playing. John's timing and Ringo's timing as rhythm section players glued, I think, the Beatles together a lot of the way. And George was a little less sort of like in the pocket as far as like where the downbeats were. It sort of floated a little bit, especially when he was younger, and he was still getting his sort of like Chet Atkins thing together.
Yes.
And then McCartney was just like so melodic, that it was just like things were moving all over the place. But Ringo's right. This is maybe overly dramatic, but Ringo's right hand and John's right hand were absolutely metronomically glued together. It was almost like Charlie Watts and Keith Richards. Rather than the bass and drums being the anchor, I thought it was the drums and rhythm guitar in the Beatles and the Stones with a lot of those records. That was the anchor. So I was absolutely fascinated. And as a session player and having been in a lot of bands, I really felt for Ringo while he was watching John and Paul and George figure out what the hell was going on with the songs.
Yes.
Because they're not asking him to sort of play a groove that they could work on. They were really like back and forth, like, what's the harmony? What does this song mean? And all this other stuff. And then he's got, time, literally time on his hands. So what is it? The patience of a saint.
Yes.
And Ringo. God bless him.
I can't.
But for me also as a fan, I've ended up working with the drummer Jim Keltner quite a bit over the years, who's a really, really good friend of Ringo's, for all those years. And then also the producer T-Bone Burnett,
Right.
who also has worked with Jim and has worked with Ringo and all this other stuff. And what I learned I never met Ringo, but what I learned from Keltner and T-Bone was that their view of what Ringo brought to everything from the Beatles and then Ringo's solo records and then Ringo as a session player for other people is literally, like Ringo says now, he was the click track.
Right.
Ringo says now at 82, when people, talk to him, well, when you were coming up, there weren't any click tracks and, blah, 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 blah. What do you do now? And Ringo just looks at the camera and goes like, I was the Beatles click track. It didn't fucking move. Hardly anything sped up or slowed down. And then there was all of this, there was this pocket in between each downbeat. And you could drive a train through that. And the Beatles, the Beatles prospered partially because when Ringo finally decided, okay, now I can start playing the part.
Yeah.
John and George's and Paul's, this is a little sort of overly dramatic because I'm a drummer, but their jobs became a little more simple, not easy, but more clear. Here's where the thing is. This is what Get Back is. This is an interesting hi-hat thing. Come together. The dugga-da. Once they finally started making those decisions, you could drive a train through those tracks. And as a player, the guitar players, God bless Ringo, because they could glue themselves onto his groove. Absolutely.
Yes, yes, I know he's so appreciated. Then but then you go to more study, don't you, during the next part of the 70s as well? At this stage, were you just fixated on learning even more at this point, rather than sort of heading off and trying to form some band?
No, absolutely. I got my degree I went to two different colleges. This Johnston College, the sort of hippie school where you sort of learn how to learn, but then I was studying percussion in Los Angeles, and then the University of Illinois in Champaign, which is about 3 hours south of Chicago. That was one of the biggest, most respected percussion schools in the country. There were 20 percussion majors, so we all learned conducting. We played on each other's compositions. We worked in the modern dance department. Half the people were composers. There was a huge composition department who wrote music for people like us. So one could be in the opera orchestra, the symphony orchestra, the jazz band, and all that sort of thing. So absolutely, I tried to learn everything that I possibly could, and I got my degree in percussion performance, and then I started graduate school,
Right.
to go, to get my next degree in performance as well.
Blimey, you really did study there. So when did you manage to sort of say, that's it? I've done enough studying. I'm now going to sort of be in bands, be in the studio, sort of doing session work.
Well, what ended up happening was, let's see, it was the first year, I was finishing the first year of my graduate work. So I was 21, something like that, 21, 22. And my percussion teacher in Illinois, a former student of his was actually in the band, the Paul Winter Consort, which
Right.
was the band where Oregon and Ralph Towner, that's the band that they came from years ago. So from years before. So I was, and there was going to be an audition for a percussion spot in that particular band. It was oboe, electric cello, bass, drums, multi-percussion, saxophone. It was right up my alley, like the sort of world music alley that I was sort of being the most interested in that point. And I got the gig. I was recommended for it by my percussion teacher, and I got the gig. So I moved to New York. It was the summer of '77, and my girlfriend at the time was a modern dancer at school, and she got a gig with a small dance company as well in New York. So we moved to the big city.
Blimey.
I went on the road with the Paul Winter Consort, and she started studying and performing with a small dance company, and there we were. We were right in the middle of the New York thing in the middle of '77.
77. So this is the period where, the birth of punk, disco, rap started. Yes. I'm not sure if rap had started by then, but then there was a huge amount of, disused buildings and crime, poverty, drugs, and there was CBGBs, wasn't there? Max's right. Kansas City, that kind of punk period that started, and there was a record label, wasn't there? Z Records that started around that time that signed a lot of bands, James Chance, Lydia Lunch, people like that. There was Talking Heads and the Ramones, and there was also people like, is it Joey Aria, who was the great kind of performing, I don't know what, a drag act, wasn't he? I think, and there was Klaus Nomi, who was also part of that kind of gay scene in New York. So did you sort of find yourself slightly crossing into the world of the Warhol factory at this point?
I did, actually. I mean, I didn't know Andy's people. I didn't know Warhol at all. I mean, this was long before I played with Lou and stuff, but yeah, in the early '80s, I was playing in bands. I was in one band with the bass player from John Cale's band, and a lot of like I said before, so a lot of my best friends in the music scene were also working with modern dance companies and avant-garde performance, like performance art groups and stuff like that. So absolutely. So yeah, my buddies were in bands like DNA.
Oh yes,
the early Lounge Lizards. Not Yoko's people. I met Yoko's people later, but yeah, I mean, everybody that I knew, not everybody, but that's oversimplified, but most of the people that I was playing with were playing sort of upper west side, sort of jazz-ish, Maxwell's kind of groovy jazz stuff. Also Lower East Side, Great Gildersleeves, CBGBs, the Pyramid Club, so in the punk scene. And then the upper East Side was Flibbity Wibbity, Way Too Many Notes, fusion bands, so and then Greenwich Village folk rock bands.
Yes.
So for me in the late '70s, early '80s, I was in bands that played in all of those places. So yes. And it was the same thing, like, even though I was with the Winter Consort, I was meeting, Steve Reich, and his ensemble. The percussion players were friends of mine, and Philip Glass's people, and the performance artist and singer and composer Meredith Monk lived in the building that I lived in, and Colin Walcott from the band Oregon was like her best friend. So even though I was younger than they were, I was starting to meet people like that. The Ramones, Television, Blondie, and bands like that were a little older than I was.
Right.
and Talking Heads and stuff, but I was going to hear them.
Yes.
And then during those years when they started getting really famous, some of the bands that I was in that were not famous, we were actually playing at all of those clubs as well. So I spent plenty of time in CBGBs, just like the pictures, with those horrible bathrooms and the really sort of embarrassing and awful backstage, and it looked and smelled as bad as people think.
Yes.
But then you got to play at CBGBs. I mean, that was where a lot of people, sort of really you learned your craft. So I was lucky that way.
And were you aware of that kind of the UK kind of new wave scene that started, or post-punk, really, wasn't it? Sort of people like Magazine, Gang of Four, Public Image Limited, the Police, not quite, but they were part of that scene. You must have went, oh, Stuart Copeland, nice drumming, things like that.
Boy. Well, I mean, yeah, I went through my Stuart phase, where I had way too many tom-toms and the octobans and 50 million Paiste cymbals. I started playing Paiste cymbals because he was playing Paiste cymbals, and like bucket a 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 bish 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 bish, Vinnie Colaiuta then was playing. He was like 20 or something. Him and Terry Bozzio, were playing with Zappa in Los Angeles, and Stuart was playing, in that, and Simon Phillips was a young player, coming up, and so Steve Jordan, the drummer, was playing, with I think on the David Letterman show and that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, I was like, how can I not be as good as them or copy them? That's not what I meant, but how can I be good enough that I could get offered or be in the middle of bands that were that good?
Yes.
I didn't want to be Steve Jordan. I didn't want to be Stuart Copeland, but I was thinking, how can I develop a voice on my instruments, percussion, hand percussion, avant-garde percussion, and drum set? How could I make my own mishmash, where people would ask me, to play on really, really great records eventually like them.
Yes. Is that the thing that you wanted, a signature sound, like someone would hear it, oh, that's Michael, that is definitely Michael's drumming. Was that something that you would think, I really want a signature sound, like John Bonham or, Stuart Copeland, people like that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've got an ego as big as a house. It wasn't like I didn't think I could break through in New York. It was a matter of when for me. And not having the sort of physical gifts, or the physical drive, like a Stuart Copeland or a Vinnie Colaiuta or even a Jim Keltner, and that kind of, I didn't necessarily have that depth that some of my heroes have had. I mean, maybe that's false modesty because I ended up doing okay, but yeah, I mean, I didn't necessarily want anybody else's gig. I didn't want to, win over, someone else's, the schoolyard, where they were doing what they were doing. But absolutely, I didn't go to New York to sort of see what would happen. I did not move to New York to sort of like, well, this might be okay, and it's a big city, so we'll see what happens. It was like, no. I'm gonna be in bands that are internationally well known. I'm gonna be able to connect the multi-percussion avant-garde world to my drum kit playing. I would like to be the Ringo of the avant-garde.
And there was a lot of avant-garde in New York at that stage as well, wasn't there?
Absolutely.
It was oozing. Did you come across people like Anne Magnuson, who was part of that kind of gang? I think they had a 12-piece female band. I can't remember, Pulsar Leary or something like that.
Pulsa. No, you're right. You're absolutely right. I had met her. I mean, there, like you said, there was Lydia Lunch. There was her. There were the Warhol, transvestites. There was Wayne County. There were sort of the heroin bands, from the lower east side.
Yes, Johnny Thunders, New York Dolls, and Suicide.
Oh, right, exactly. And so, I mean, I wasn't necessarily in those groups, but it really mattered to me that artists who were that theatrical and that sort of devoted to their own personalities in a way. I mean, again, sometimes too much and narcissistic and unhealthy and that sort of thing. But I didn't necessarily think I needed to be a miserable, like junkie to make good work. But I could sort of understand where someone was actually making decisions about how to express themselves.
Yes.
And that way, so And yes, I mean, I was a huge XTC fan really, really early. I was an Elvis Costello and the Attractions fan, like really, really early. Police really early. I was and also people that I ended up working with and meeting later on. I was listening to Henry Cow and Slap Happy, and there were Dagmar Krause, and Can,
Oh, yes.
and groups like that. And I was like, wow, Chris Cutler, the drummer that was on in some of those bands. I was thinking, I want to be like Chris Cutler. I want to be like Chris Cutler and Colin Walcott combined, Colin from the band Organ,
Yes.
or if I could combine those sort of ways of thinking where you could play a song that is as well built as a Kurt Weill, theater piece, and then get the spling splong, what was then eventually called like junkyard percussion, into the drum kit and make that work. I was like, sign me up. I need to find artists that are interested in that stuff, because that's exactly what that's what I want to develop.
Yes, we love the Weimar Republic, don't we? So that period was
Well, the
always
industrial stuff, and then I ended up working with Blixa
oh,
a few years
Blixer.
ago. Long after he left, Neubauten and all that other stuff. But I knew who they were. I was starting to meet people, like Jim Sklavounos, when he was in Eight-Eyed Spy, long before he was working with Nick Cave, and so I was starting to meet people who were developing that kind of vocabulary, in the
Yes.
drum world, and then starting to get picked up by those like real poets, like storytelling, band leaders, and by the mid '80s, I was like, I need to get into a band like that.
So because was the first one Rain Dogs then? Was that
Right.
your
Yes.
big moment? Was that the one that sort of opened a few more doors for your next kind of real chapter?
No, absolutely. Tom and Kathleen, his wife partner, and then Island Records, that they ended up with a list. He had already been in New York, I think, for a year, maybe, starting to write what ended up being Black Rider and some of the other theatrical.
Had he done his Francis Ford Coppola film by then?
Yes, he did.
Right.
Right. He met Kathleen on a Coppola film, and which was like 5 years before that. And then they got together, and then Swordfish Trombones was rejected by Asylum. And then Chris Blackwell from Island said, I'll take that. Thank you very much. So, I mean, I wasn't there when that happened, but that was Victor Feldman, playing all of these percussion instruments that were from all over the world and extremely tactile. And Tom had a Harry Parch understanding of different kinds of tuning and keyboards and string instruments and percussion instruments that were sort of non-Western and non-traditional. Tom was absolutely like, if he could explore that kind of stuff, in sound, he was moving toward having those kinds of sounds in all of his songwriting, even though his bulletproof songwriting was still intro, verse, chorus, bridge, outro. You could make really sort of conservative versions of all of those songs, and they still stand up because they're so beautifully written. But he didn't want the actual expression of those particular songs to be that way. So anyway, long story longer, as usual, I was on the list, that included people that had worked with Laurie Anderson, people that were working with Brian Eno and David Byrne, and I had been heard in some other bands,
Right.
where I was an interesting percussionist, from downtown New York, with people that I had respected. And I got a call from the PA, the personal assistant, the production assistant from Island Records, who had seen me on the list, and then also Robert Musso, who was the engineer, the recording engineer for Rain Dogs. He'd had a reputation doing a lot of avant-garde world music, downtown New York stuff as an engineer. Brilliant man and great guitar player. We had worked on an off-Broadway project together. So he knew sort of how I was thinking as a multi-percussion player who also played drums. So he also recommended me. So I was on the list in two ways, So I tip my hat and, be very grateful to Bob, Musso, that helped bring me in. So I got the call, had all my road cases with instruments from China and Japan and Thailand and 3 drum kits, the Ringo drum kit,
Yeah.
and 40 cymbals and pieces of car parts and all that. And I could play marimba, okay. I could play vibraphone pretty well, glockenspiel, my sort of background in orchestral percussion. I could sort of do enough,
Yeah.
that sort of make arrangements of all of those things. And then the first song that I played, they brought me down, and then I opened up all of my road cases and said to Tom, here's a whole bunch of stuff, here are like 1,000 different, like bits and pieces of stuff. So let's start picking things that look like they're fun, and we can start to build the tracks, this way. And he put up Big Black Mariah first for me, and I did the clank and crunch part on that as an overdub, because that was one of the first tracks that they had ready to go. And then that was it. They invited me back, every day after that, so as you said, I mean, that ended up being Rain Dogs.
Yes, and the sort of, yes, it's kind of, because he done Swordfish, which I guess is the introduction that a lot of people had at that stage. Because
Yep, absolutely.
I think he'd come to the UK a few times and performed on the Tube, which was one of those programs we had on a Friday afternoon, evening. So and
we played on the Tube in 1985.
Oh, did you?
I mean, he was probably there before, because he had, like you said, he had toured a lot since the mid '70s, up to then. But Paulie Yates and Jules, they were the presenters. So the Rain Dogs band, we did that. I think we were on with REM or something like that, if I remember correctly.
Right.
It was like one of those legendary Tube moments.
Yes.
I'm sure it was there before us, but yeah, we did that as well.
God, that was classic. Because then, after that, where do you sort of head? Do you keep with Tom at this stage, or do you sort of veer off into other directions?
Not really veer off. I mean, exactly like you said. I mean, when I've been teaching and talking about career and stuff, and being ready for a break, or being ready for an opportunity, I say to my students, the day before I went into the studio with Waits, that first day with Rain Dogs, I was an interesting New York percussion player. The day after that, I was Tom Waits's percussion player.
Yes.
And absolutely, Mark Rebo, the guitarist, came in, that week, and Ralph Carney, the saxophone player, came in, during that period. So the band that became the Rain Dogs band, we sort of came in, right then, at RCA Studios, where Elvis Presley and Frank Sinatra and all kinds of people had recorded. So there were ghosts in the building when we were there. But to answer your question, boy, that first tour, it was who came to see us? Bette Midler, who was an old friend, David Byrne, David Bowie, Sting saw us in Paris. Elvis Costello, saw us a bunch of times. We got to know U2 then. We got to know REM then, because they were big Tom Waits fans.
Yes.
So they were really coming to a lot of people were coming to these shows. And the answer to the question was, I ended up working with a bunch of those people because they heard me play with Tom. And during one of those tours, it was in Los Angeles with Tom, and Elvis Costello and T-Bone Burnett were making the record that was going to be called King of America.
Oh God, I love that album so much.
So the last track, me too, and the last track that was finished was the cover "Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood,"
yes,
the Animal song. And so T-Bone and Elvis came to one of the Tom shows and said, because we had a day off the next day, and he goes, "Michael, can you come in and do a marimba part for Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood?" So we brought a marimba to the studio, and I worked out a part, and the headphones, I was just in heaven. I mean, for anybody who's listening to this, who has headphones on, wondering how pinch me, I'm in this room. The track was done already, so I was doing the overdubs, but it was Jerry Sheff on bass, from Elvis Presley's band from the 70s,
Mm.
and Dylan, and Jim Keltner on drums, who played with everybody that I loved, and Mitchell Froom on organ, and Elvis and T-Bone Burnett on guitar, and then that was the track, and then Elvis was going to do a guide vocal. So Elvis did a guide vocal. He had a cold, his lungs full. It wasn't. He didn't like it very much. But then at least he did a guide vocal because we needed something to sort of help finish the track. And then I worked out the marimba part, and I went scrape, 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 and I got to do the ding, doo, 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 doo.
Oh yes, that's a classic.
On marimba, for fuck's sake. It's like they let me double the riff.
Yes.
Marimba. And for me, I was just in heaven. It's like, this is the coolest thing in the world, because many a zillion years before that, I was a huge Animals fan as well. So I was thinking, this can't get much better. And what ended up happening was they finished the track, they used everything that I did, and then they also used Elvis's guide vocal, because he went back to try to make it better, and it never got better. Anyway, long story longer, again, then Elvis invited me to be in the first version of the Confederates. So when the King of America tour was first put together, after King of America came out, it was James Burton on guitar from Elvis Presley, Jerry Sheff on bass from Elvis Presley, Jim Keltner on drums from John Lennon and George Harrison, Mitchell Froom, the producer, on organ, and me. So I was on marimba, vibraphone, tambourine, multi-percussion, all this other stuff, with Keltner. And so yeah. And then after that, I kept working with Elvis.
Yes.
But after King of America, the next year we did Frank's Wild Years with Tom in Chicago. So again, to answer your question, I kept on working with Tom, and then I started working with Elvis. So from project to project, I got to sort of leapfrog between them. And then I was doing sessions with Suzanne Vega, and I played on Sean Colvin's first album for Columbia that got the big Grammy. And so I ended up being in that New York world.
New York. Was the Sean Colvin, was that Sunny Come Home album, or was that
No, I played on the actual first one. Yeah, Sunny Came Home was the one where she got Record of the Year.
Right.
But I think she actually got like a gold record and a Grammy for like new artist or something. It was Steady On. That was the first album that she did. Yeah. So I did all the percussion and the layering and stuff on that one as well. And,
yes.
And Suzanne Vega's third album, so I got bumped up.
You did get bumped up
in the universe. I did, and Tom and Kathleen, they put me in a spotlight that really just made a complete difference.
Yes, it's interesting because there's two artists there. Mm-hmm. the Elvis Costello, obviously he was having a few moments with his band, The Attractions, so things weren't going quite there. And Suzanne Vega was having real problems with her third album, wasn't she? That was kind of her tricky one as well. Because I've done funny enough, I've done quite a lot of interviews with people who played with Suzanne on those first 3 albums, and it was kind of interesting because I don't think that experience that kind of left her. I don't think she plays any material from that third album. Did you? And because she did the first one and thought she'd sell 20,000 copies. This New York singer-songwriter, it was like, oh, you're now a megastar. You're going to tour the world. We'll completely do you. Then we would like a new album quite quickly because actually, people are quite fickle. So could you get on with it? And that was quite tricky, wasn't it? Getting her second album together.
Well, the second album. The third one, actually, the one I played on, I think, like you said, is the tricky one. It was Days of Open Hand.
And that was when she was with Anton, wasn't it?
Yes, Anton Sanko. And I was good friends with all of them. I mean, they were all working with Sean Colvin as well. It was the same management company. And it was after Luca. I mean, the good news was that the Solitude Standing album was the one that blew up, with Luca and Tom's Diner and all that sort of stuff. She might not play very much stuff from for better or worse. I mean, I won't take it personally. I hope it's not just because of all the clanks and crunches and the marimba parts, that Anton Sanko and I worked on, on the third album. But yeah, I mean, that was a breakup album for her. After that, she and Anton broke up, and yeah, I mean, it wasn't the big hit, but at least I got to play on an album, with like 12 Suzanne Vega songs. I mean, that was pretty cool.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I was at that stage kind of very intrigued because I don't know if you probably didn't go to her Glastonbury when she was playing the main pyramid stage on the Saturday night
Okay.
and got her death threat. So she's got this big coat on that she had to wear
Right, I heard about that.
because
Yeah.
I think the bass player had sort of found himself with a strange stalker who wanted to kill them both. So it's rock and roll, isn't it? These things always happen.
Right, folk and roll. I mean, right? If you grow up in New York, you think if you've got an acoustic guitar and 4 o'clock in the morning and no one understands me, that you might get away from the violence. But people are nuts. People get nuts and right, exactly. They stake out celebrity and take it too personally. It's too bad.
Yes, and Spike, because obviously Elvis,
Right.
by then had sort of the attractions. Him and Bruce weren't getting on so well, were they? I
Right.
think, and so he was kind of veering to quite a different one. So when he did Spike again, that was quite a different sound, wasn't it? And
Absolutely.
the songs are
A
great,
lot of
but
it. Yeah, I mean, for better or worse, I mean, a lot of the reason that it doesn't sound like other Elvis Costello records is partially because of me. I mean, it was T-Bone Burnett and me, and the engineers Kevin Killen and Elvis. I mean, we were the first team to actually start doing all the tracks together, and Elvis really wanted. I mean, some of the stuff was done in Dublin, and some of the stuff was done in London, but he really wanted to changed the sort of sonic texture for a lot of his songs. And he loved the Tom Waits stuff so much. And he and I had already been playing together because I was in the first version of the Confederates. So he asked me early on, when he was writing the stuff with McCartney. I mean, I was already on board, so
yes,
and hardly anybody had heard the songs yet. And I still have that. I still have the cassette, from Paul and Elvis, the duet songs, that four of them went on Flowers in the Dirt, and the others, ones went on our record. But yeah, I mean, he really wanted, he was, Elvis was understanding more or curious more about some of the downtown New York stuff. He
hmm
didn't necessarily want it to be avant-garde, but he was thinking, well, maybe percussion could be a little different, and combining drums and percussion, or taking traditional drums kit away and then building up another kind of environment that still sort of propelled the song, but it wasn't going to be like hi-hats and snare drums and stuff all the time. He was
yes,
interested in that. So he brought me in to do that. I mean, I co-arranged more than half the record, with T-Bone, and Rebo played a lot of the guitar parts, on that as well, a lot on sort of Spanish nylon string guitar. So Mark Rebo and I didn't sound at all like what we were doing with Waits.
no,
But it was that way of thinking. And Elvis really had a good time. Oh, I was also on the tour that Elvis did where the attractions would do um, 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 I Want You, and that record,
with Blood and Chocolate.
the Blood and Chocolate, the sort of the beginning of the end of the attractions record. So they would do that. And then the Confederates would do King of America and a lot of R&B covers. So I was in that tour as well. So yeah, I think Elvis, as usual, just sort of wanted to try something different. And
Yes,
also but the good news was we made Veronica work. T-Bone knew, and Elvis knew, and I knew, and everybody knew that there needed to be at least one hit for the first Warner Brothers album. And it wasn't like Elvis wasn't writing well, but I think T-Bone picked Veronica as the one that was going to sort of drive, to be the captain of the ship, for
yes.
to make Warner Brothers happy, and also be a song that just sounded fucking great live. You know, so we did, and I helped with the arrangement and the timpani and the bells and the splings and splongs and the sort of like blowing up in your face and all that other stuff, and then that great vibe, that perfect tempo, for the amount of syllables and all the words. I mean, it worked. It really, really worked.
Yeah,
And
no, it
so,
was fantastic. I got really fond memories of Elvis because I saw him quite in his early days when it was
right,
very intense with the attractions. Then I saw him at Glastonbury Festival where he did quite a set on his own, and I thought, God, this is a bit dull for the main stage.
okay,
And then suddenly the curtains came back and the attractions were there, and they were really pelting it out. And then decades later, I saw him with Burt Bacharach doing that
right.
Painted by Memory, they did a couple of dates in London, and that was just magical because I just love both Elvis and Burt Bacharach. So, and that was a great album. It's just such a beautiful album. So it was a lucky time, really. But yes, it was kind of curious. But then, as the decade changes, and I often notice that, the producers change, the sound changes, then you have a musical trend that, we suddenly got the ecstasy, there was a dance scene going on, Chicago house music, then there was grunge with Seattle, and then, like the next kind of record labels are looking for the next gig, and it's Nirvana. So wait, how do you as a musician think, oh, blimey, I'm not quite sure about this and that? And then you find yourself, with Lou and John Cale. What was, how did you manage to navigate that?
Well, let's see. I mean, part of it was just a wish list. It was like a bucket list for me. Being in New York, I mean, I was working with singer-songwriters like Joe Henry and doing more sessions with T-Bone Burnett. And, we had done the Spike tour with the Route 5. And, so things were going pretty well musically for me as a multi-percussionist, wanting to incorporate sort of what I liked about the Bacharach stuff, Four Seasons, Beach Boys, Victor Feldman, Swordfish trombones, if I can sort of sneak in a lot of these different kinds of sounds into pop music, then that was what I really wanted to do.
Yes.
So I was lucky in that way, and I got sort of respected for being able to pull that off. So it didn't all sound like throwing shit down the stairs just because you want to throw shit down the stairs. It was like, no, it's this kind of tune, and it's those kind of gongs, and this kind of shaker thing, and that's what works with the guitars. I mean, it was really like well thought through sonic choices. And so I was lucky to be known for that. And so what happened? The big transition sort of in a way for me was I was in New York, and I had worked with Scott Litt before, the producer Scott Litt, because I knew the REM guys.
Yeah.
And I'd played with them, and they'd played on a couple of them, and played on the records that I had produced. So we sort of knew of each other, and around the same age-ish, that kind of thing. So I got a call from Scotty Litt, and he was producing Paul Westerberg, with the Replacements.
Oh yes, Paul. Good
so and they were making a record that ended up being called All Shook Down.
Yeah.
And it wasn't really called that yet. And in the beginning, well, you probably know better than I do, but in the beginning, it was going to be a Paul Westerberg solo album. It wasn't really going to be a Replacements album. But then, Tommy Stinson started to play, and then, Slim Dunlap started to play, and then Chris, came in and started playing a lot of drums. And then Scotty called me and said, Michael, we got a problem. That we're making a record that's going to be the next Replacements record. And Paul Westerberg is not happy with Chris's, drum parts. So he wants to start replacing all the drum parts, but you can't tell anybody. And I was like, oh shit. Okay. Well, the good news is I really liked Paul Westerberg. At the best of his writing, I was thinking this is really interesting.
Yes.
And then of course, this is REM's producer calling me going like, do I want to play on this record? Do I want to play drums, drum set, not the layering stuff, not the junkyard stuff, not throwing shit down the stairs, but like meat and potatoes, Charlie Wattsy kind of stuff. And I was going like, absolutely, just throw the shit at me. So I went to the studio and had all my stuff delivered. And then again, in perfect, at that time, Replacements mode, that first night when I met them, Tommy Stinson was there, and Scott and Cliff Norrell, who was the assistant engineer, they were working together. And of course, Tommy and Paul and I went out and got drunk. That there was that as happens many times in New York, the street level place is a bar.
Yes.
So we went right down from the studio and got plastered. And it was like a grilling kind of thing, not a macho drinking kind of thing, but Paul hadn't stopped drinking then yet, so I think he wanted to see whether I would be like a buddy with him, not to get all fucked up and play badly, but it was like, could he and Tommy and I sort of like have a good time?
Yes.
And then we went back upstairs and played badly, but then it was great, so all my stuff was set up and ready to go. So then during the next 2 days, I replaced the drum parts on more than half the album, with not being able to tell anybody.
Yes, this is tricky.
There were songs called Happy Town and The Last and all kinds of other stuff, where it's me, sort of playing like Charlie Wattsy kind of stuff. And I'll make the point that the good news was Paul liked it and kept almost everything that I did. Scotty Litt was really happy. As a producer with the REM people, we were friendly and worked really well. He got what he needed so they could mix. Now, here's the thing. Here's the other thing that sort of changed my life. That next week, when they started mixing the album, which then was going to be a replacements album called All Shook Down, it was on the same record label as Lou Reed. It was on Sire. And I had already been in touch with Lou because he was on my bucket list of people that I would like to play with. So I had contacted him through Melanie Chacon, Madonna's sister, who was working for Danny Lanois and Brian Eno with Sire Records and stuff. So, excuse me. So Melanie set it up where I could call Lou, and then we talked. And then I said, I'd really like to play drums on the next record. I know that you're in between bands and blah, 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 blah. What do you think? So I sent him some stuff like he asked. And then he called me back and he said, I don't hear anything, that really matches what he was looking for his next band. It was after the New York.
Which is, yes, amazing album.
Which is like one of the best records like ever, ever, ever.
Yes.
So to even think that I might work on some of the stuff that was written like after that, I was just pinching myself. But then Lou said no. I mean, I'd already worked with Allen Ginsberg, writing music for Allen's poetry. I'd been on those Elvis and Tom Waits records and riff, but that didn't really get Lou going. So he heard that I was replacing the replacements drum tracks on that album, so we called Scotty up, and he said, I hear Michael's playing drums, on what's going to be this next replacements album. Can I come down to the studio and listen? So Lou Reed, big bad Lou Reed, went down to the studio and listened to the tracks that Scott was mixing that had me on drums, and he called me up that day. I was in Woodstock, at Bearsville Studio, working on another record with Gavin Friday from Ireland, and we were doing a record there. And so Lou called me up at Bearsville, and he goes, Michael, you got the gig. You're my next drummer, because on those tracks I sounded like Charlie Watts.
Right.
It was like hardly any cymbals. It wasn't like buggada. It wasn't, junkyard bish, bish, bish. It was just like, there's the meat and potatoes, so he could hear that I could do that. And that's what he wanted for what ended up being Magic and Loss.
Yes, amazing. Yes, that was a good one. I did an interview with Tommy recently, actually, I think, because he's got a new kind of album out, and then he went into, was it Bish and Bash and Pop or something?
Oh, exactly. Oh, there you go.
And Guns N' Roses, and God, he is so rock and roll, isn't he?
Oh, he's
got an acoustic combo, so he's kind of calmed down a lot. So yes, Magic and Loss, because obviously No Pressure after New York, which was one of the great albums of the 80s. But then, Lou's really pulled it together at this stage, hasn't he? His kind of next period. This is because with a Lou album, it was like, it's not that great, is it, really? But then, New York was like, okay, Dirty Boulevard, just so many Romeo and Juliet. I mean, there were so many great tracks on that album. Even side 2 is brilliant. So it holds together. So Magic and Loss, and Laurie was he with Laurie at this stage as well?
No, he was still married to Sylvia.
Because I'd seen her because she had done Strange Angels, which was a brilliant album. I went to see that live and thought she was just mesmerizing. So, okay.
I think they met and got together like as a couple. I mean, he and Sylvia later on, a few years later, separated. And I think they separated, I think, either during or after the Velvet Underground reunion in 93.
Right.
So this was like 91, 92, 93, ish. That I was working with Lou, because he had done Drella, with John.
So you didn't work on that one at all?
No, it's John, it's Cale and Reed. That's it. It's only them. It's only guitar, I think, violin and piano, and them, both of them singing.
Yes. So Magic and so how was it? You'd work with obviously a huge amount of people, but people like Elvis and obviously Tom Waits, and there's Paul Westenberg. So what was Lou like? Because I've interviewed a few people journalists who brought out books, and they've had some great kind of Lou moments where he just destroys them, quite quickly. And they kind of almost loved it, oh, fantastic, he's already destroyed me, in the first couple of minutes of this interview. This is going to be really painful. So what had he loosened up by then?
Well, in a way, I mean, he took apart a bunch of journalists, during the years that I was with him as well, and right, it's sort of a battle scar in a way, or it's one of those tattoos, the journalists want to show everybody, like, I survived a Lou Reed interview kind of thing. But one of the things that I learned was, I mean, when Lou and I started to get to know each other, he was writing the lyrics and the music with Mike Rathke, for what ended up being Magic and Loss. And,
yes.
And, Doc Pomus and Rita had died, during that period. I mean, he was starting to write music anyway over like a year period. And then he lost people that were extremely close to him for real. It wasn't a PR stunt. It wasn't anything. I mean, he really got hit hard, and he was getting closer to turning 50, that kind of thing. I mean, I don't know whether that had anything to do with it, but yeah, I mean, New York was a bit of a hit. The Drella thing was really well respected, and he could get back with John Cale and blah 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 blah. And Sylvia was doing incredible business for him as his manager, I felt. And then also she was also doing a lot of the graphics and the scenic design and album design with him, with the people at Sire Records. So the albums were looking great. He was healthy. He was. I mean, he was clean and sober. I mean, absolutely no drugs. I mean, there was nothing like anywhere near that. And, he would have some wine sometimes and that sort of thing, but he was really clean. And during rehearsal and during the gigs and all that other stuff, no beer on stage, no drinking at dinner, that kind of thing. And it's like, if afterwards, if you wanted to have, some wine at the hotel or something like that, then great. But absolute focus on the music, so it was Rob Wasserman on bass and Mike Rathke on guitar, like on New York. So I was the new boy in school.
Amazing. Yes. I mean, can you remember, because my favorite song, probably everyone says, is Sword of Damocles. Was that an interesting one to bring together? I do love the lyrics as well on that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and then, it was that big sort of, is that the one that has the big sort of like Hal Blaine? Ding, ging, 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 ging.
Yes.
With the guitar synthesizer. Do 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 ging, ging. I mean, that's Hal Blaine, Be My Baby.
Yeah.
That's Be My Baby in 1963 with Ronnie, with Ronnie Spector. So, but yeah, I mean, I guess one of the things that I'll always be happy about was that Lou allowed me to come up with a part that sounded different for each song. So there were a couple that were barely on brushes, that with no big bass drum kind of moving things forward. There was, there was Magic and Loss, with the big theatrical gang 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 gang, and go for it, bish 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 bish, and then What's Good, nice and focused, and then the stuff with little Jimmy Scott, so for me as a drummer, I was lucky that he trusted the songs. Mike Rathke's, arranging Rob Wasserman's, voice and tone on the electric upright bass. One of the things that'll sort of scare maybe younger session players, or maybe make older session players laugh if they're listening to this, is that for the Magic and Loss album, we did about a song a day after weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks of rehearsal, like absolutely tearing every song apart, all the lyrics, all the stories, all the characters, the kind of kit that I was going to build for him with a little bish and clank and crunch and that sort of thing, but not a Tom Waitsy one, but just more under control trash can sounds. So there weren't a lot of high end cymbals, so we could sort of build a deeper, sort of darker kind of drum kit, which he thought was fine. So what ended up happening was, when we were in the studio making the album, it was pretty much a song a day, and he would pick out the one, and we were all there in the studio all day. And then Mike and he would play the guitar parts and into the interlocking guitar parts. and then Rob would play his bass part, or Lou would do what could be like a keeper vocal, for the song. And then it was either before or after Rob did the bass. And then I was on last. The drum kit was on last on every song,
Right.
without click track.
No pressure then.
So no pressure, exactly. So I needed, thank God their time was really good. Things didn't really speed up or slow down and that sort of thing. But Lou did not want to have headphones on, while he was tracking.
Yeah.
So there wasn't like, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock for them to play to. Then, on the time code for me to play to. So I had to memorize the sort of nooks and crannies of every song every night. And I was on last. And with me, again, with my sort of like cheerleader ego, I was not going to let us go home without the drum track being done.
Yes.
So it could be like midnight, after two guitars and Lou's vocal and Rob's, beautiful bass. And then, okay, Michael, here goes. Let's go. And I was like, fuck, because I'm around all day, trying to see where everything goes and how fast are they doing everything. And I was going, I am not going to look bad making this record. I'm not going to send Lou home thinking that he doesn't have the track finished, where he had insomnia anyway. So it wasn't easy for him to sleep. And there was no way, as his new drummer, I wasn't new by then because we'd been rehearsing for so long. And I knew the writing process. So we were really together. But I was like, I want everybody to go home thinking that we've really got it, no mistakes, no speeding up, no slowing down, no shitty parts, and that sort of thing. So if Lou wanted to come back the next day and go like, let's try again, that would be up to him.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't be like, well, gee, Luke, I'm so sorry, I don't really feel it, or can we try it tomorrow? And it was like, no fucking way. By midnight, we're done. Let's go to bed, and the next song starts tomorrow. It was my sort of like San Diego macho. It was like, I'm not gonna fail here.
Yes, God, that's quite intense, isn't it? And then what's your next path after this? Do you then veer off into another direction in your career?
Boy, that's interesting. Not really. I mean, I was still playing up through the 90s and stuff. I had met my lovely Swedish partner, who I've been with for like 37 years.
Yes.
We met in New York in 1987. So I'd been playing with Tom. I was playing with Elvis, and it was before I started playing with Lou. So it was that late 80s period. Lena and I got together, and I started coming over to Stockholm, where she lived, here in Sweden. A lot, in between all these gigs. But I was still doing sessions for T-Bone Burnett in Los Angeles. I played on his then wife's record, Sam Phillips.
Oh, yes.
Cruel Inventions, that's me. I did a lot of the arrangements with T-Bone on that. And there were like folk rock people like John Gorka and other people that were friends of Suzanne and Sean Colvin. So I was playing on records like that. And
Victoria Williams. I think you played on one of her albums.
I did. I produced Swing the Statue.
Because I think I really had a big moment with Suzanne. It was her follow-up album, Loose, that I was a bit obsessed with.
It's an amazing album. It's a really, really beautiful record.
It builds up from Swing the Statue, and then Loose is just like unbelievable. So
it is actually. I was lucky. I had worked with. How did that happen? All right. Who knew me? I mean, the band in LA and the manager knew who I was, and Rough Trade. That's right. The Rough Trade A&R person had heard of me through working with other records and that sort of thing, and knew I was like an indie producer kind of guy. So he put me together with Victoria, I think. So we put together a band and rehearsed, and then made Swing the Statue in Los Angeles.
Yes.
And that helped her. That helped her sort of find another voice. In a way, one of the things that really was good that came out of that, which I'm really proud of, was that after Swing the Statue came out, it was Tarbelly and Featherfoot and Swing the Statue and Boogeyman and Can't Cry Hard Enough. There were a lot of songs that were really, like, really, really beautifully written songs. And
Yes.
I gave that CD to Lou and Sylvia Reed, and they just fell in love with Victoria's storytelling. And Lou was just like, Tarbelly and Featherfoot, I wish I wrote that song. So I got them in touch with Victoria, and that
Yes.
ended up actually being the thing that ended up creating the Sweet Relief, the health and well-being, sort of fund.
Yeah.
It was for her because she was starting to get ME. She was starting to
Yes.
get nerve problems and stuff like that. But Lou became a really big fan of hers. And then to answer your question, because of working with Victoria and producing that record, Soul Asylum had the same manager, and they actually did a version of Summer of Drugs,
Right.
on the Sweet Relief album, and then they were making with Michael Beinhorn the record that ended up breaking them like big, with Runaway Train and stuff, which I wasn't involved in, but it was around that same time, of making those records in the early 90s and stuff.
Yes.
And
Because
then
there was people like Vic Chestnut, wasn't there, as well? He was on the scene.
Well, Victoria introduced me to Vic Chestnut. Victoria introduced me to Jeff Tweedy, and we knew a lot of the same people in Georgia, that were friends of theirs, and the REM people, everybody was sort of friendly, with
Yes.
each other. So absolutely. And so to answer your question, I got to be on a bunch of records that were involving some of those people as well.
Yeah, there was a kind of really amazing chapter of fantastic singer-songwriters. It went a little bit as alt country, didn't it? Because there
Right.
was Stacey Earle, there was Gillian Welsh. You mentioned there was a guy, Joe Henry, who did a brilliant album with a track called Monkey from an album, I think, called Fuse, which was just brilliant. And there was a guy called Jim White who had, I think, someone like Lucinda Williams doing Static on the Radio, which was just this.
Yeah.
It's a lot of great, and Rosanna Cash did a album called 10 Songs Demo because she thought, well, I'll do these, I'll take them to the producer, and he said, no, they're fine, just let's do them, let's not overproduce it. So it was a kind of, you were there at sort of a glorious time of that kind of getting back to that more rustic sound after the bombastic 80s, I think.
It's sort of true. I mean, when I did the first John Colvin record, John Leventhal was the producer. John and Sean were a couple then. So the first Columbia record, and then he still did Sonny Came Home and stuff after that. They broke up after that, but and then John went on to marry Rosanna Cash. So like you said, I mean, some of the stuff was not incestuous and stuff, but like you said, a lot of people were meeting different people around that time. Within a few years, Suzanne Vega had broken up with Anton Sanko, and then he moved, to LA and started doing, the film scores. But then, she got together with Mitchell Froom, and then they made 99.9 Degrees, and they had and then so a lot of Victoria's friends I had met as well. So you're absolutely right. I mean,
yes, because I saw Suzanne tour, and I think it was her sort of mid-90s album. They had, was it Pete Thomas from the Attractions on drums, actually, at that stage?
Yeah, Mitchell was using Pete on a lot of the stuff. Yes, absolutely.
Yes, that was a fantastic album. So yes, your 90s, you were hopping from Sweden back to America.
I was going back and forth. The thing that ended up with Soul Asylum was that they hired me to be the music director and arranger for their MTV Unplugged show. So during the 90s, MTV Unplugged in the States was a really big thing. So Runaway Train was just about to come out, and they knew it was going to be sort of big. And then they needed somebody who could sort of be a band leader and sort of a big brother to pull. I mean, they were tired, they were just about to be famous, and they'd never been famous before, and things were really working for them. And it was going to be a big push, from Sony and MTV. So I was brought in to co-write the charts, do the arrangements, rehearse the band, and sort of get them in shape, for the TV show. So it was, and I had. It was almost like the Confederates multi-percussion setup for me. I had timpani, I had vibraphone, I had marimba, I had all kinds of shakers and tambourines and glockenspiel and blish, blish, blish. And then those were all worked into, the arrangements, and with Unplugged, no electric guitars, not a whole lot of drum kit. We had Ivan Neville, on organ, and we had three wonderful session players that were friends of mine from New York. You know, it was a string trio, and that's the show we did, and it worked out really, really, really well.
Had they hadn't worked with Sterling Campbell at that stage, had they?
They had, but nobody was supposed to know. Because at the time Sterling sort of did for Grave Dancers Union what I did in a way for the Replacements All Shook Down. You know, so Sterling came in. It's Sterling on Runaway Train, if I remember correctly, and Sterling on a lot of the other songs on Grave Dancers Union with Soul Asylum. But the Soul Asylum actually had a touring drummer, and their regular drummer was on the show. Sterling joined. Right, I can sort of tie this together. They also did another bigger orchestra, unplugged kinds of things with much music in Toronto.
Right.
So they hired me again to be the co-music director, you know, co-writing the arrangements, rehearsing the band, you know, dealing with the string sections and all that other stuff. So we did a show in Toronto that ended up being a full, you know, video production.
Yes. It's interesting because obviously he goes on to work with David Bowie quite a lot, but before that, he was always good on his kind of musicians. He worked with Dennis Davis, didn't he, on those kind of late 70s albums, who just had the most extraordinary sound, didn't he, on especially the Low album's production of his drumming is just stunning.
It really is. I mean, and what was it, Carlos Alomar and I think Earl Slick the first time, and you know, that sort of thing, and the Scary Monsters, and you know, and all that sort of thing. And you know, Dennis was there. I never met him, but he was there during the 70s. But right, what ended up happening was that Sterling had the Bowie gig, and then Soul Asylum offered Sterling an actual piece of being in Soul Asylum. So he took a sabbatical from Bowie, and then went with Soul Asylum for a while, and then he left Soul Asylum and went back to Bowie. And then in between there's Zach Alford, you know, Zach and Sterling, for all the drum aficionados out there. They both, I think, went to the High School of Performing Arts,
right,
in New York City. So they were sort of, and also Charlie Drayton was younger, and Steve Jordan was older. You know, so some of the best drummers coming out of New York actually went to that high school.
Right.
But so when Sterling was playing with Bowie, Zach was playing with B-52s.
Right.
And then they sort of went back and forth, you know, in some of the best bands of the 90s. I mean, absolutely. Zach and Sterling were two of my absolutely favorite drummers.
Amazing. So then from that period, how do you then sort of navigate your next decade and sort of where you are now?
Well, I guess the thing was, I started thinking that I wanted to sort of plant my feet and my heart and my career more in Sweden. And the 90s, it was Dennis Pop, and the beginning of Ace of Base, the beginning of Max Martin.
Martin, yes, the famous Max.
Yeah, absolutely. Before he became famous, he was a bass player and a singer in a hard rock band called It's Alive. And then he started working as like an extra engineer with Dennis Pop. You know, he did Ace of Base and Dr. Alban and that sort of thing. That was the beginning. It was before Backstreet Boys and before Britney.
Yes.
But they started actually getting some hits in Europe. So they all started getting recommended for all this stuff, which is now what everybody wants, from Katy Perry to Pink to you know, Justin Bieber and Justin Timberlake and all that stuff. But actually my version of that was I was starting to meet some of those people, even though that wasn't really the music for me.
Yes.
But the indie music scene, I started, the short answer was I started producing indie bands in Sweden. And so I was producing and doing arrangements for indie pop bands here.
Were they kind of like British indie pop bands in sound and quality?
Yes, sort of. I mean, there was, I mean, most everybody were Blur and Oasis fans.
Yes.
You know, and Pulp, you know, and that kind of thing. But there were bands called Eggstone, This Perfect Day, The Wannadies, Popsicle. You know, there were a lot of really, really good Soul, Salt. You know, there were indie bands. A lot of them sort of made it okay. The Cardigans were probably
yes, well, they were the yes.
best.
Yeah, Rise and Shine was their kind of big breakthrough, wasn't it, really?
Absolutely, yeah. With the powerful Nina. I mean, what a wonderful singer. And then the
Yes.
band was so musical. I mean, everybody here was happy when they started to break through.
Yeah, so you sort of got into the zeitgeist of that period, really. And then obviously there was a rise, yeah, like Max Martin. Then there was a period when ABBA were really sort of frowned upon, and then there was the musical, and
Right.
then the stage music, and then suddenly everything became cool again with Sweden, didn't it?
It did actually. I mean, in the 70s, a lot of Swedes, and not to generalize, but there was the anti-war movement here, in Sweden. There was the political sort of folk rock was a plus. You were telling stories and against the establishment and against the war and that sort of thing. And those were the cool bands to be
Mm,
in. Not the cool like in leather, pants and good shoes, but the cool meaning sort of politically correct. Though that's why you have folk rock, so you can tell political stories. So the
yes.
so that the actual pop bands, they were getting on the radio like ABBA, they were really frowned upon by a lot of people. Little did everybody know that, 40 years later, almost everybody still talks about ABBA and they don't talk about the political bands anymore, really. I mean, but then on the other hand, you take the ABBA songs apart and they're absolutely indestructible. Every single thing is a hook. Their melodies on the melodies. Everybody can sing. That sort of Swinglish. It feels good. The recording aficionados, later have gone in to figure out what do they do with Verispeed? What do they do with like doubling and tripling and quadrupling the voices and the guitars and the drums and everything to get this sound?
Mm,
Now, they're like the Einsteins of 70s music production, and they deserve it.
yes.
Benny and Bjorn are absolute top of the line thinkers as far as building songs and arrangements and stuff. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yes, it's perfection, really, isn't it? Let's face it. Did you
Oh.
then keep in production, or did you sort of start doing other bits as well, or
Well,
being?
yeah, I guess I've always done a little bit of everything. I mean, in the late 70s, when I got out of grad school with the Paul Winter Consort, this was like 77, 78. I was I was giving workshops and master classes in creativity, improvisation, collaboration, jamming, and also I was teaching music in modern dance companies,
Right.
at a couple different universities. So anyway, long story longer, I had always been teaching. So I was never teaching because I couldn't play. I was teaching because that's how you present, the pass on the baton.
Yeah.
It's like the tradition goes through the players who also teach. I felt, and in New York in the 70s, a lot of the best players they were teaching at the Berklee School of Music in Boston. They were teaching in the jazz department at Princeton. Pat Metheny was teaching when he was 18. And these amazing players were teaching all over the United States. Excuse me, when they weren't on tour. So for me, it was like, yeah, teaching is the thing that you do to learn more about your own craft and
Yeah.
to present to other people that experience. So yeah, I mean, the last 20, 30 years here in Sweden, I've been teaching master classes, being on panels, working at music conferences, South by Southwest, yeah, helping teach people how to actually network. How do you meet people? What was it like, in New York to sort of go from interesting situation to interesting situation and not screw stuff up?
Mm.
Gratitude, meditation, all kinds of things. So
Yes.
it's always been a bit of all of that.
And did you also have, your self, I wouldn't, it's not self-sufficiency, but realizing that you were going to have to clean up yourself in terms of diet, lifestyle, yoga, running, things. Were there moments that you thought, yeah, I'm gonna have to start doing this stuff now if I'm gonna enjoy
Hmm.
my later life?
Not really in that way. I mean, I was lucky that all of the experimenting and the sort of creative chemicals, that I took from the 70s and 80s and stuff, I enjoyed. I enjoyed actually the trips. I enjoyed the sort of recreational, what is the world, and you know, what are clouds and what's water and how do things sound. I mean, I'm an old, San
Yes,
Diego,
the universe
Southern
could be
California
this little
hippie.
speck under my nail.
Well, I mean, I wasn't so much like sitting in, in the mud going like, oh wow, that this is the world. But absolutely. I mean, one of the things, I mean, this is sort of maybe true because, going through therapy off and on during my life, just to sort of clear out my brain, you know, I was lucky that I didn't have the type of addictive personality where the types of recreational moments and adventures, chemical adventures or psychedelic moments, or I never got stuck anywhere. It was really like
Right.
going to Disneyland part of the time. It's like
Excellent.
this is Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. This is going down the Matterhorn. This is what do my senses do? So I mean, because I had done Gestalt therapy, I had been in other therapy, I'd done in mind games and that sort of thing in college in the 70s in California, as we did. So it was more like, wow, how does the world work? An atom is like a tiny universe, that sort of thing. I mean, without going like, oh wow, Timothy Leary. It was like, no. All these vibrations, that is music.
Mhm.
Those are the building blocks of what I do for a living. That's really interesting to me. So I enjoy that, and I didn't get stuck anywhere. I could have and should have, been working out more the last 40 years. I've gone through, my cancer scare and operations, and then I'm in my late 60s now, so things aren't working as well as they used to. But I didn't necessarily beat myself up like some of the people like on the Lower East Side did. I was never a junkie. I didn't get stuck. Like
Yeah.
some of the hard rock people did. Absolutely not. And I didn't go through the kind of stuff that Lou did or that Bowie did. I mean, I enjoyed, colors and senses and all that other stuff, but I didn't get stuck really.
Yes. Well, that's brilliant. And for what projects have you got lined up now, and you're sort of going to be doing in the next 12 months?
There's a new creativity and music hub called The Node, which is right downtown Stockholm. And literally, anybody who's ever been to Stockholm, there's a fountain right next to the big culture house in the middle of a bunch of hotels and right where the main subway station comes in. And it's co-sponsored by the city of Stockholm, the Tim Berling Foundation, which is Avicii's family, the late great, Tim Berling, who was Avicii, the EDM guy who died, unfortunately. So there's a mission and a brief about health, fitness, sensory, making records, culture and society, that sort of thing. And so we have a space now that's been built with multiple recording studios, rehearsal spaces. There's a restaurant and a bar and a performance space. So we're starting to build this sort of like new hub of music and creative activity directly downtown. So that's my main gig right now. I'm working with them as a consultant.
Yes.
I'm what am I called? I'm called the community creative lead,
Excellent.
which means that I can call up, people that I've worked with over the last 10, 20, 30 years and see if they'll work with us or teach a class or, be on a webinar and that sort of thing.
Nice. And
Right.
with your advisory, board on
Mhm.
southwest by southeast.
Right.
Yes.
By
What does that
Southwest.
mean?
Well, um, there's a subset of the advisory committees called panel pickers. So I'm on the group of advisory board people around the world who are then given the submissions for what people would like to present. A panel, a presentation, a meetup, a product placement, how the world works, AI, being in the recording studio, fashion and music and health, that sort of thing. So people like me actually then watch and listen to like 200 each submissions, for what will be the on the schedule, the official schedule for the next year.
Right.
So I finished that during August. That there's a period where around the world, people who have done this for a number of years and are trusted, by the South by Southwest administration. They go out into the creative business industry, and people like me then really go through, can this people speak? Is this a really compelling idea? Is this just someone trying to sell their own product? And also we then literally advise the South by Southwest administration on things that we think should actually be in the official schedule, for the next year.
Yes.
I started going to South by Southwest in the late 80s. I was there in the first or second one, like 35 years ago. I've known a lot of the people on the board forever. I've played there a bunch of times, like with Chris Stamey and Peter Holsapple from the DBs. I've played there with Marshall Crenshaw. So and I produced records there, so a lot of people in Austin, Texas have known me, since then. So
Yes.
I'm happy to still be involved. I'm happy they still let me come to the party.
Excellent. God, that does sound. You've had the most extraordinary life. I have to say, it's been absolutely mind blowing how much.
So far, so good.
Well, yes. Well, hopefully another 20, 30 years, and
Thank you.
you've cracked it. Well, look, thank you. I'll let you go now. But thank you ever so much for giving me the time for this. This has been absolutely fascinating, and yeah, it's just so stimulating, I have to say. And if you want, I can always send you the link, and you can always put it on your social media platform sites.
Okay.
And yeah, because I'm absolutely fine with that. But yes, well, thank you for saying yes, and thank you for giving me the time, because it's been an absolutely fascinating journey, actually.
And thanks back, David. It was very kind, for you to reach out to me. So I really appreciate it as well.
Yes. Well, look, have a lovely evening, and I'll keep in touch. But take care. Thanks a lot. See you later.
Thanks.
Bye. Bye. And that, dear listener, is the end of the interview. You'll probably gather that. A massive thank you to Michael Blair for giving me the time for that interview. You can find out a bit more about him if you, I suppose, kind of go on various search engines and Facebook as well. I believe he's got quite a bit of information there. This has been the C86 Show, David Eastaugh. So if you want to contact me, you can. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. That's C86 Show, just Google that. And also, all these interviews have been archived on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. It's true. So, have a great week. Stay safe.